Good morning. I'll just begin from the very beginning. What I was saying is that in the last class, we were looking at this problem of radiation exchange in a in-body enclosure, and the surfaces were assumed to be diffuse and gray. And so we came up with this network representation of radiation exchange, and basically figured out that for each and every surface, we will have a radiosity node Ji, which will basically be sort of like a nodal value from which will lead to the total current, radiative current, being split into many paths, if I can say it. Okay, and we came across this eventually, that the total heat exchange, or the amount of heat that either you have to add or remove from each surface to maintain it at a constant temperature, is given by can be written in two forms. One is in terms of the nodal values or the surface values, and the second is in terms of radiosity, so in terms of radiation exchange of each node or each surface with the neighboring surfaces. So in what I want to do today is very quickly show you how this method can be used, or what is the procedure to work out problems of this kind. And what and maybe we'll do one or few examples which are simplified scenarios, which I will consider today. So one thing you need to realize is that if you look at this part of the problem, so this is basically in terms of Ji, and see, the unknowns are J's, the radiosities are unknowns in this problem. So what we need is what we need to calculate is are these J values, so n values of J, so J1 to Jn. So if the surface temperatures are known, okay, then it makes sense, because if surface temperature is known, then EBI is known. And so it is, if and see, either the surface temperature will be known and QI will have to be calculated, or the QI would be given and surface temperature will have to be calculated. So that is how the problems are typically posed in steady state radiative heat transfer. So what we will be doing is, if Ti is known, then we can use this equation or these two equations. Let me put it this way: if Ti is known, then we can use these two equations to calculate the J values. And if Qi is known, then I would use this along with this to solve the system of equations. So for each surface where Ti is known, I will set up the right equation, and for each surface where Qi is known, I will set up the Qi with Ji equations. And so we can establish n equations in that manner, and then solve to obtain what would be these J values. So let me take an example. So let's look at a simple case of two surface enclosure. And we can take two surface enclosure in the following way: that let's say that the one surface is flat. So this is, let's say, surface 1, which has area A1, temperature T1, emissivity A1, no, epsilon 1. And maybe the second surface is the surroundings which are around this surface. So this is, let's say, area A2, temperature T2, emissivity epsilon 2. And so what we need to calculate is the radiative exchange between these two surfaces. So I need to calculate what is Q1, and I know that because there are only two surfaces, and Q2, maybe if I want to put it this way, that Q2 is maybe going in, I know that Q1, or rather I should put the Q2 actually the other way around. So if Q2 is this way, then I know Q1 is minus Q2, and let's say that is Q12, the total amount of radiation exchange between these two surfaces. So the easier way to work out this is, of course, I can use this method as I told you. I can say that if T1 is known, or if even if T2 is known, I can actually work out using the method that I just described. But there is a far easier way in this problem specifically, is I can actually expand this network notation, this network representation that I had drawn. I can actually expand it and include, for node, let's say J1, the node with which it's exchanging radiation, which is, or the surface with which it's exchanging radiation, which is surface 2. So we can draw in this form that I have the first node being EB1 and Q1 coming in. So that sees a surface resistance of 1 minus epsilon 1 by epsilon 1 A1, which goes to J1. J1 sees a resistance corresponding to the shape. So that would mean that we'll have 1 by A1 F12 with J2. And then J2 has its own resistance because of the emissivity of surface 2. So this will be 1 minus epsilon 2 by epsilon 2 E2, which is goes to EV2. So if, let's say, surfaces, if I had to say that, let's say, the surface temperatures were known, let's say T1 and T2 were known, then I can write that the net rate of heat exchange or radiative heat exchange in this problem would just be the difference of potentials divided by the total resistance. So the difference of potentials is EB1 minus EB2, and I know EB1 is sigma T1 to the power 4, EB2 is sigma T2 to the power 4. So I can write this as sigma T1 4 minus T2 4 divided by the total resistance. And because the resistance are in series, so we'll have 1 minus epsilon 1 A1 plus 1 by A1 F12 plus 1 minus epsilon 2 by epsilon 2 A2. So that would be the radiative exchange when you are dealing with any two surfaces which are diffuse gray and that form an enclosure as I've shown here. Okay, some of these examples are actually also given, or some more generalized, some more cases are given in the book in the form of a table. So your book has these some examples that you can actually also work out on your own now using the same method that I have described. And we'll just take one specific case, one special case, which is this one, which is actually the case that you would have also looked at in your, in your JEE exam. So this one, this is a specific case that I will consider now, just to show you how we get this equation, as I, in fact, which is used very without knowing the implications of how we even reach there. So let's say we have an enclosure, a large enclosure, and we have a very small convex object inside that enclosure. Convex would mean that F1, I mean, for that object, the view factor is 0. So let's say this surface or this object has temperature or area A1, temperature epsilon or T1, and emissivity epsilon 1. The surroundings are A2, T2, and epsilon 2. And we need to calculate what would be the total radiative exchange between these two bodies. So if I say that the body is small, let's say this surface is small, so I can, let's say, take this limitation or this consideration that A1 by A2 is approximately 0, that the surface 1 is very, very small as compared to surface 2. In which case, of course, I also know that if the body is convex, F12 will be 1. So all radiation leaving surface 1 will actually go to surface 2. So I can use this equation that I had just written here, which is true for a two surface enclosure, or two bodies in an enclosure. I can use it as it is, and so I can write Q12 in this case, which was sigma T1 to the power 4 minus T2 to the power 4 by 1 minus epsilon 1 A1 plus there was 1 by A1 F12. So now you need to remember that F12 is 1 plus 1 minus epsilon 2 A2. And what I'll do is I'll multiply the numerator and denominator by A1. So I'll get sigma A1 T14 minus T24 divided by 1 minus epsilon 1 by epsilon 1 plus 1 plus 1 minus epsilon 2 by epsilon 2 into A1 by A2. So in the limit that A1 by A2 is very small, this number goes to 0, or we can ignore it. 1 minus epsilon 1 by epsilon 1 plus 1 becomes just 1 by epsilon 1. So what we get is epsilon 1 A1 sigma T14 minus T24, which is something that you have used. I'm hoping that you have used very commonly. Okay, so this method then helps in calculating radiation exchange between surfaces. So we will try and limit ourselves to 2 or 3 surfaces. So let me choose a specific case of a 3 surface enclosure, which also has a specific meaning. So we look at what is called as a re-radiating surface. And a re-radiating surface is some kind of an idealized surface, and it is a surface which has zero net radiation transfer. So this is a surface with zero net radiative transfer, and that is what is called as a re-radiating surface. So what it means is, for this kind of surface, Qi will actually be 0. So these surfaces are typically very well insulated on one side. So so it's basically, again, remember, because radiation is a surface phenomena, that is what we've been saying. So if you insulate on the other side of the surface, it basically means that the surface, whatever energy it receives, it actually has to give out. That is how we get a re-radiating surface. Now, because Qi is 0, this actually works out. If you look at what we have been doing so far, if Qi is 0, then in that case, EBI becomes equal to the radiosity, and which is also equal to the irradiation. This is based on our analysis from the last lecture. So if we knew GI, for instance, if I know the irradiation on a re-radiating surface, then I can calculate the surface's surface temperature, or that temperature, because EBI goes as T to the power 4. Or if I was given the temperature of that radiating surface, I can actually calculate what would be the radiosity or irradiation incident on that surface. Now, what we will see is that, or rather, if you go by the definition of QI was written as EBI minus JI 1 minus epsilon I by epsilon I AI. Now, EBI being equal to JI, which is 0 in this case, QI is 0. So it means that this, for a re-radiating surface, its radiative properties do not depend upon its emissivity. So the temperature of this surface will be independent of its emissivity. And when we do these calculations, the re-radiating surface emissivity will not come into play. So to show you how this works, so as I said, we will take a 3 surface enclosure, and I will take one of those surfaces to be a re-radiating surface. So let's say we have a 3 surface enclosure. Okay, and we will use this concept now. So let's say the surface that we're dealing with has, maybe it's in the form of a triangle, or rather the enclosure is in the form of a triangle, and we have the top surface, which I'm going to label as surface R, whose area is AR. Let's say temperature can be written as TR, emissivity maybe epsilon R. That is a re-radiating surface, so that is the reason I've shown it as insulated. It's insulated on one end, or one side, which is the other side, not the side which is facing the radiation. But you can imagine that right behind that surface, you have somehow created an insulating layer. And let's say this is area A1 T1 epsilon 1, and this is A2 T2 epsilon 2. And so the question being posed is, how much radiation is exchanged between surfaces 1 and 2 when you have a re-radiating surface. in the problem. If you had a real, I mean, if the surface was not re-radiating, then you will have to follow up the method that I was describing earlier by drawing those network elements and calculating each of the specific radiosities. But we will try and use the same approach, because that, as I will show you, that makes a problem much simpler to solve, even though there are more than two surfaces involved in this problem. So say if I look at terms of just pure network representation, and I also see that because the surface R is re-radiating, QR will be 0, which means clearly Q1, which is the heat leaving surface 1, should be equal to minus Q2. So whatever Q1 is giving out, Q2 must be absorbing that, because surface R is not giving out any heat. If you do an entire energy balance on this enclosure, then one is giving and one is receiving. That's how it has to be. The third surface is not giving anything in terms of radiative heat or in terms of heat transfer. And remember, we're doing all these calculations at steady state. Unsteady behavior is very different, where for which some of these assumptions would not hold true. So if I draw the network problem here now, let's do that one. So we start with EB1, which has surface resistance of 1 minus epsilon 1 epsilon A1, and that goes to J1. Now between J1 and J2, we will have a resistance which will be A1 F12 inverse. J2 can be connected to EB2, where the resistance of surface 2 will come into play. But now so even though I said that surface R is insulated, but it doesn't mean that it cannot receive irradiation. So what it means is, so we wrote here, right? J1 Ji is equal to Gi. So it has some finite irradiation and it has some finite radiosity. So what we will now have is a modification here. We will have some resistance to, let's say, A1 F1R inverse to the radiating surface corresponding to JR, and then we will have some resistance corresponding to A2 F2R inverse, the view factor resistance. But what we also have is, if I want to just complete this picture, what we also have is EBR and a resistance corresponding to 1 minus epsilon R AR. And sorry for this mess that I've created here. Let me just write it bigger. So heat transfer is taking place from surface 1 and it's going out there. But we also know that, so there are two paths, and before I add two paths, I also see that QR, which was supposed to come from here, is 0 in this case. So this line is dead. So this network, this much part here is actually dead. And JR is actually equal to EBR. That we already worked out from the definition of QI or QR. So now what will happen is, in this case, Q1, which starts from here, will actually split into these two network elements. So Q1 splits, some part goes into this network, some part goes through this, but what goes through this will actually see twice, I mean not twice, but two resistances. So it has to flow through this network and join back here to go to Q2. So the problem is quite simple in the sense that now if I have to calculate Q1 or Q12, which is the net rate of heat transfer between surfaces 1 and 2, I need to add a few resistances which are in series. So for instance, A1 F1 R inverse and A2 F2 R inverse are in series, but these two will actually be in parallel to A1 F1 2 inverse, and the equivalent resistance corresponding to this network should be in series to 1 minus epsilon 2 A2 and 1 minus epsilon 1 by epsilon 1 A1. So we need to keep all these resistances into account while calculating what would be the total radiative heat transfer. So having described this, I can just quickly now write what the final answer will be. And this is just a matter of adding the resistances in series in parallel. So this will be EB1 minus EB2 divided by 1 minus epsilon 1 A1 plus, now first of all, A1 F1R and A2 F2R will be in series, so they will have to be added. A2, sorry, F2R, they will have to be added, then inverted, which would mean take a reciprocal and add that to in parallel to A1 F12. So I will just write A1 F12 here plus 1 minus epsilon 2 A2. So that becomes the total heat transfer going from 1 to 2. Now, once Q1 and Q2 are determined by this, let's say because T1 and T2 were known, for instance, or and so we have calculated Q1 and Q2 based on this from this simple equation. Now I can determine J1 and J2 as well, because once I have Q1 and Q2, I have, let's say, Q1 here. I also know EB1. I can straight away calculate J1 because I know Q1 is the resistance is known. So Q1 is the current flowing through this potential drop under this resistance. So J1 can be calculated. Similarly, J2 can also be calculated because Q2 is going here and we have a certain resistance and known one potential is known. So I can calculate the other potential. But what if I have to calculate JR? How do we calculate JR now? So to determine JR and surface temperature TR, that is what is the question. So to determine JR and subsequently TR, what we can do is we can look at QR, which was supposed to be summation JI, or in this case, JI would be JR. So JR minus JJ by AR FJR, if I can write this way, FRJ actually, not FJR, FRJ inverse from J going to 1 to N. In this problem, N will be 2, okay, and this is 0, QR is 0. So that means JR, let's say minus J1 by AR, or I think one of the things that I have written in my notes as AIFIJ anyway. So I can replace, so I use a reciprocity relationship to say this will be A1 F1R inverse plus JR minus, let's say, J2 by A2 F2R inverse will be 0. So we'll have a linear equation for JR, and J1 and J2, as I said, have already been calculated. So now JR can be calculated from this equation. And then once JR is known, I can write JR to be equal to sigma TR to the power 4. And so TR can be calculated. So for a radiating surface, as I've shown here, it's a 3-body enclosure, by the way, 3-surface enclosure, but a 3-surface enclosure with some specific property, we can still calculate what would be its temperature and what would be the net radiation exchange between that surface and its surroundings. Okay, any questions on this? This is the last thing I wanted to discuss about radiation, and my work on radiation ends here for this course. So any questions on this before I move on to the next or the new topic? No? Okay. So let's begin with a discussion on convection. And this is the last mode that we will discuss in this course before we maybe take some applications. So remember, I mentioned convection when I first started in the introductory part, I mentioned convection is a mode of heat transfer which happens because of bulk motion of fluid particles. So that is the essential philosophy that we will be following. Second thing is that why are we looking at or why are we studying convection? There are two reasons. One is, of course, we want to understand what are the physical mechanisms governed by when having a bulk flow and fluid particles can take away or can carry away heat from a surface. That is one part, which is to understand the physical mechanisms, and which is what we will do in the early part of this segment or this module. And the second part is also we want to look at methods to determine or to perform these convection transfer calculations. So we will develop some methods, and specifically everywhere that we have, that you guys have been working out these problems which had some convective component, for instance a boundary condition. Everywhere I have been mentioning that the convective heat transfer coefficient is known, but now we will actually work out how it is determined. That is one major issue. So once the convective heat transfer coefficient, which is the central pillar of all convection calculations, once we understand how it is determined, then doing those calculations becomes more meaningful. The other part is that we will focus more on convection heat transfer, but convection mass transfer would be very analogous to convection heat transfer. In fact, I will establish some analogies about how convection mass transfer is very similar to convection heat transfer and how they can actually be calculated simultaneously. But we will look at convection mass transfer as well. So whatever I am doing in terms of convection heat transfer, please remember the same thing is also applicable for mass transfer. So to begin with convection heat transfer, let's just take one scenario. Let's say we have some airfoil and it sees maybe a fluid which has some velocity, free stream velocity v, or far upstream velocity v, and temperature T infinity. And let's say the surface, this is an isothermal surface. So the surface is maintained at temperature Ts, where Ts is not the same as T infinity. So if I take a small element of area on this airfoil on its surface somewhere, which has maybe area, this element has an area of dAs, then if I look at the heat flux on that segment of area, we can write the heat flux, the local heat flux, as H Ts minus T infinity, where H is the local heat transfer coefficient. And why am I saying it's local heat flux or local heat transfer coefficient? So as we will also see in this segment, that the heat transfer coefficient can actually vary with position because of change in flow conditions. The flow conditions on the surface will actually be changing because of various fluid phenomena, most importantly the development of boundary layer. So the boundary layer has a very strong influence on the local heat transfer coefficient, which we have of course been ignoring so far. Okay, but now we're getting into the real technicalities of it. The total heat transfer on this body will be, let's say, q, which can be written as the integral of the heat flux over the entire surface, which I can also write as H Ts minus T infinity dAs. And knowing that Ts and T infinity are constants, typically we'll have Ts minus T infinity coming out, and this will be integral H dAs over the surface As. And I can replace the integral H dAs by an average value of heat transfer coefficient into the area, surface area, into Ts minus T infinity. So this is the average heat transfer coefficient, which is applicable for the entire surface, not just for one specific location. So knowing the local H, we can integrate that local edge over the surface of any body, and we can obtain the average heat transfer coefficient, or even the total area, the total heat transfer from that surface. Now, a similar thing can also be done for convection mass transfer. So, say we had this some kind of a similar airfoil, or maybe the same airfoil, which was exposed to a fluid with some concentration of a species A. And again, if I say that on the surface, maybe the concentration is CAS, which is not the same as CA infinity. So A is a species, subscript A denotes a species, S denotes surface, infinity denotes the far upstream, or I would say free stream condition. Okay, so we can write the mass flux in a very similar way here. Mass flux now, or rather, in terms of convective heat transfer, mass flux is typically is a misnomer. When I say mass flux, it doesn't mean it's actually mass, but let's look at what it would be. It would be more like molar flux, but capital N would be denoted, or would be used to denote the flux of any species, mass flux of any species over, let's say, surface element DAS. So N double dash A would be HM, which is the mass transfer coefficient, times CAS minus CA infinity at any position. Now, A, what is species A? A would be typically some kind of a vapor phase which is being transferred due to evaporation or sublimation from the surface. So if the solid was maybe, or if the surface was maybe a solid, then sublimation of a species that is residing on the surface of this solid will be, the sublimation would result in this species A getting transferred from the surface to the surrounding fluid. If the surface was a liquid, then evaporation would lead to transfer of species A from the liquid to the fluid. So A will typically be a vapor phase. Remember that, and that is a vapor phase which is very susceptible to evaporation or sublimation. Okay, so that is the flux. Now there are some specific things you need to know already. Flux has units of kilomole per meter square second. Concentration has units of kilomole per meter cube. And because of this, the mass transfer coefficient will have units of meters per second. In the case of convective heat transfer, the convective heat transfer coefficient had units of watt per meter square Kelvin. But here it is meter per second, but the idea remains the same. It is a constant of proportionality, which is saying that the flux is proportional to the temperature difference or concentration difference between the surface and the free stream conditions. Also, HM is the local mass transfer coefficient. It is not the average coefficient. We can also calculate the average coefficient. For instance, if I wanted to write total mass transfer from this surface, let's say NA. NA would mean, again, specific subscript A means species A. That would be HM bar into AS CAS minus CA infinity, where HM bar now becomes the average mass transfer coefficient. So it is also convenient sometimes not to work in mass transfer, not to work with concentration, but to work with density. But density and concentration have a very simple relationship. So I can write density of species A to be the concentration of species A times its molecular weight. And so the mass transfer rate, or the mass flux, which I will write as small a now. Okay. So in terms of constant, if I am writing the equation of mass transfer in terms of mass density, where rho is a mass density, I can write this as HM, the constant of proportionality remains the same, except now we will have rho as minus rho infinity, and the total mass transfer will be HM bar as rho as minus rho infinity. So you will see this quite often. Again, let me remind, rho has units of kilogram per meter cube, and C, which is concentration, will have units of kilomole per meter cube, not mole per meter cube. Okay, we are working with SI units. SI units typically take kilomole. Okay, now temperature is quite easy to understand when we are dealing with heat transfer calculations. Temperature of the surface is something which is easy to imagine that there is some temperature on the surface. How do we get CAS on a surface? Because as I said, this substance A is one which is either going to be sublimated or evaporated from this body, whichever, whether it's a solid or a liquid, it doesn't matter. So typically CAS or rho as is determined using thermodynamic equilibrium at the surface temperature Ts. So what we will assume is that at the interface of the liquid, or the interface between the gas which is passing over, which is this gas with velocity v, the gas and this substance A reach a thermodynamic equilibrium at the surface, and so the concentration at species of the species A on that at that location will be governed by the temperature at that position. So I can say that CAS corresponds to concentration of species A in the vapor phase or saturated vapor phase at temperature Ts. So we can write CAS to be concentration of species A saturated condition at temperature Ts. That would be typically how we will specify, and I should say vapor phase, by the way. I should be also very careful here that we're talking of vapor phase, not liquid phase. The concentration in the vapor phase corresponding to this temperature Ts. So you can imagine if you're dealing with, let's say, evaporation of water vapor, right? You're dealing, maybe you have flow of air over a maybe a sheet of, or a pond, let's say, where there is water. So we will say that if the air is actually moving at some, let's say, 25 degrees Celsius, and the surface is maybe at some temperature, I don't know, 20 degrees Celsius, it's a cooled surface, then the corresponding temperature or the corresponding density that we will choose will be of vapor phase, which is a water vapor at 20 degrees Celsius. So there's a subtle difference. You'll have to understand how this is to be done. The simplest example, or the other example that I can give you, is if some of you may have used these desert coolers, right? These coolers use this, uh, or you may have even studied this in energy conversion or energy technologies in the last semester, where I think cooling towers may have been introduced. So cooling towers also use the same concept, that you have basically cooling because of water coming in contact with surrounding air, which is at a higher temperature, right? So water basically also tends to evaporate. So it evaporates at the saturated condition. So the water temperature governs the saturation condition, and the vapor con- uh, density, which you can use from lookup tables, from the thermodynamic tables, would be used to dictate what would be CAS or rho as. Okay. Now, what we are doing in this part of this module, as I said, we are more concerned with calculation of these convection heat and mass transfer coefficients. So the whole purpose of doing convection analysis is to determine what would be H or HM. So these parameters H and HM, not only do they depend on the fluid properties. So fluid properties would mean, let's say, its density, or its specific heat, its thermal conductivity, its density, its viscosity, specific heat, etc. We will see that they also depend on the flow condition, and by flow condition I will basically be talking of laminar or turbulent flows, and they would also depend on the geometry, the surface geometry on which this flow is going to happen. More precisely, geometry and flow conditions will have a strong influence on the boundary layer development on this, on a surface, and boundary layer will be shown to have very very strong influence on how H and HM change. Even locally, as I was saying earlier, that we defined a local heat transfer coefficient. The whole point of defining the local heat transfer coefficient and not a single heat transfer coefficient, that I didn't say it's constant over all the entire surfaces, because I said it's governed by flow conditions, it's governed by development of a boundary layer. So we will consider those cases. So let's just look at the boundary layers first, and we look at boundary layers of all types. Now you have only considered the hydrodynamic boundary layer or the velocity boundary layer in your fluid mechanics. So let's say, for as a simple case, let's consider a flat plate or a flow over a flat plate. So say we have a plate on which there is a uniform flow, which has, maybe let's say the free stream velocity is u infinity, u infinity, and we can fix a coordinate system in this way. Y is measured from the surface of the plate and x is measured from the leading edge of the plate. So we know in this case that there would be a boundary layer, a hydrodynamic boundary layer or a velocity boundary layer that would develop, because the surface is stationary. So the fluid particles close to the surface will actually come to rest. So there would be diffusion of this information, that there's a rest surface, so that information will propagate. So it will go farther and farther away into the fluid because of momentum diffusion, and so you will have a boundary layer that would develop in that form. So we call this as, or we'll use a symbol delta as a function of x to denote this velocity boundary layer. Now, typically, delta is that thickness, as it's defined in fluid mechanics. It is that thickness at which, so delta is that thickness at which u by u infinity is 0.99, or 99% of the velocity has been reached, or the free stream velocity has been reached. That is the velocity boundary layer. Now we also know, I think this is something that I don't need to remind you of, but you should know this, and I've drawn it already, that delta increases with distance. So delta increases with x. So as you go farther down, there is more and more momentum diffusion into the fluid. And one of the main purposes of calculating or deriving the velocity boundary layer is to calculate the skin friction coefficient. CF, which is given as the ratio of the local shear stress versus the dynamic pressure. So local shear stress for an internal fluid can be written as mu du dy at y0 by, again, half rho u infinity square. So that is one of the main parameters that we will deal with, or you would have also learnt about in fluid mechanics. Now, similar to the velocity boundary layer, we also have thermal boundary layer. So we go back to the flat plate again. This time, let's say that the flow coming in has some uniform temperature distribution. So this is T infinity. and the quantity system will remain the same, still x and y measured in a certain way. And now what you would see is the development of a thermal boundary layer. Or before I say this, let's say the surface is at some temperature Ts, which is not the same as T infinity. So what we will have is, because the two fluids or the surface and the fluid are not at the same temperature, so the fluid particles will actually come locally at equilibrium with the flat surface or with the plate, which is at a higher temperature, let's say, if Ts is more than T infinity. So we will have the development of a thermal boundary layer. The thermal boundary layer thickness is defined in a certain way. So it's defined in a way that if I say this is delta T subscript T, which will denote thermal boundary layer and which is also a function of X. So delta T is that thickness at which the temperature ratio Ts minus T by Ts minus T infinity becomes 0.99. That is the definition of the thermal boundary layer. So T is the temperature in the boundary layer at the location at which the boundary layer temperature reaches a certain value, which gives you this ratio to be 0.99. That is what we will define as the thickness of the thermal boundary layer. Clearly, thermal boundary layer will only develop if Ts is not equal to T infinity. If Ts was equal to T infinity, you won't have a thermal boundary layer, but you would still have a velocity boundary layer, but not a thermal boundary layer. Please remember this. This is the key part. Of course, I've also one thing I should mention. I have so far assumed that the surfaces are isothermal. So the flat plate has a constant temperature Ts, and it remains at Ts everywhere on this, along X. Now there is a key idea now that I want to introduce, which we have not spoken about so far, but that is about the rate of heat transfer at or into the boundary layer from this, let's say, heated surface. It need not be heated, by the way. It can also be a surface which is cooler than the surrounding fluid, and the boundary layer will also have a similar shape. It doesn't matter. I'm not very concerned about that right now. Okay, but what happens right at the surface of the boundary layer at this location? So at the surface of the boundary layer, or rather at the surface of this plate, where the fluid particles have all been brought to a halt, they've come to a rest. So at that location, there is no bulk flow, and so heat transfer from the solid, which is a wall, to the fluid happens only because of conduction. So locally at any given location, Q double dash S, which is the heat flux at any given point, would actually be given as a convective or rather a conduction heat transfer by the Fourier's law. So we can write heat flux to be minus kf dt dy at y0, for the reason that at that location there is no bulk flow. You will see there, because of the boundary layer, you will see layers of layers. So the particle next to the solid will actually have some velocity, and then the velocity keeps increasing. But at the surface, there is no bulk flow. So the flux is only because of conduction, but this conductive flux is then carried through the layers by bulk flow. So it, by Newton's law of cooling, this becomes equal to H times Ts minus T infinity. Newton's law of cooling is something that we have already introduced earlier. So the definition of H, or the heat transfer coefficient, and this is, please note this is very important, is it is the ratio of these two quantities, Kf, or rather the conductive flux, by the temperature difference across the boundary layer. So flux at the surface at y0 by the temperature difference across the boundary layer. Now I can use this equation or this fact here to say a few things about the variation of heat transfer coefficient in the boundary layer or on the surface along this distance x. the first thing I can see is, or before I say that, let me also say this here. Since Ts minus T infinity is a constant for our, at least the discussion that we have been doing so far, and I also know that delta T, the thermal boundary layer thickness, will actually increase with increasing distance, similar to the velocity boundary layer. The velocity boundary layer also grows with distance. The thermal boundary layer also grows. And why does it grow? Somebody may say that, how do I even believe this, that it will grow? So let me say it now, but we will prove it later. The momentum diffusivity, which is nu, the kinematic viscosity. What the kinematic viscosity is to the velocity boundary layer, the thermal diffusivity is the same thing to the thermal boundary layer. In fact, nu and alpha, remember we introduced this parameter alpha, which was k by rho Cp. Alpha is also called as a thermal diffusivity. It has this exact same function of propagating thermal signal through a fluid, that the same thing happens by momentum diffusivity, which is nu. When you have a surface which is at rest, the momentum diffusivity results in propagating that, there's a surface which is at rest, so it sends out the signal, and that's how you get this development of the velocity boundary layer. So momentum diffusion happens because of nu. Remember, so if nu is large, you get a thicker boundary layer, a thicker velocity boundary layer. If alpha is large, you will get a thicker thermal boundary layer, and we'll discuss these in the next lecture. But for now, let me say delta T is, it increases with increasing distance from the leading edge. If it, of course, it cannot decrease. I mean, physics will be defined. If the boundary layer thickness, we know it would be zero at the leading edge, but then it grows and then decreases. That won't make any sense. It just implausible to think of, even that intuition does not work. So delta T must clearly increase with x. Now, because delta T increases with x, that means dt dy, the temperature gradient at y0, will actually decrease with x. So think it over. If you're not able to figure out, the only hint I can give is that it has to, the boundary layer, remember the boundary layer, we define it as the distance across which the temperature grows to about, to get to this ratio, right? So if the boundary layer is growing, then the variation will become gradual, more and more gradual. So clearly dt dy, the slope itself at location 0, at y0, will actually decrease with increasing x. The second part is that because dt dy is decreasing, so h will decrease now. If you see this equation, dt dy is decreasing, k is a constant, ts minus t infinity is a constant, so h will decrease, and so will the local heat flux with increasing x. So heat transfer coefficient will go from a maximum to a decrease, and then something else will happen, which I'll show you in the maybe today or in the next class. Okay, so that is how local heat transfer coefficient and local heat flux will change along a surface where you have convective heat transfer. Very similar to convective heat transfer, I can also do the same thing for convective mass transfer. So again, let's go back to the plate and say we have a flow over this plate. The plate has some concentration CAS, which is saturated concentration of some species A, and what is being brought with the free stream is some concentration CA infinity. Okay, and here I will make an assumption that whatever analysis I will do for mass transfer, it will be for a binary mixture. So the mixture will be some A plus B. Only two components will be there in this system, which is called as a binary mixture. Binary for obvious reasons, because there are only two choices. So we'll consider a binary mixture of A and B, but A will be the one which will have this transfer from the surface. So in this binary mixture, again, you will have a boundary layer development, which is the concentration boundary layer. Concentration boundary layer. and we will define the thickness of the concentration boundary layer as usual, as we've been doing, or very similar to temperature, that this thickness delta C, delta subscript C, which will denote the concentration boundary layer. So delta C will be that thickness at which CAS minus CA by CAS minus CA infinity becomes 0.99. So that would be defined as a concentration boundary layer thickness for all things going forward. Okay. Now, similar to what I have been doing to tell you how we get in thermal boundary layer, how we get the heat transfer coefficient, we can also derive the mass transfer coefficient in mass transfer analysis or in convective mass transfer, but we use another law. So we use Fourier's law in convective heat transfer. I will use a counterpart of Fourier's law, which is called as Fick's law or Fick's law of diffusion. And Fick's law of diffusion is actually exactly the same as Fourier's law of heat conduction. And the Fick's law of diffusion says that the mass flux, or in this case, molar mass flux, I will say, because N, capital N now is, I said, is for molar, is for moles, not for mass. So molar mass flux is written in terms of a diffusion coefficient, which is DAB times the concentration gradient on the surface, of course. But I'm saying in general, this is how it's written. The molar mass flux or Fick's law basically says that the flux is proportional to the concentration gradient. So DAB will be called as a binary diffusion coefficient, and it also has units of meter square per second, similar to kinematic viscosity and also thermal diffusivity. So the same logic is applied here as well, that at the surface or on this solid, the fluid particles come to a rest, and so transfer must take place due to conduction or due to diffusion. So I can write that the local mass transfer coefficient times CAS minus CA infinity should be equal to minus DAB DCA dy at y equal to 0. So on the surface, the flux because of diffusion should be equal to the total flux across the boundary layer because of convection. And so we can define the mass transfer coefficient as minus DAB DCA dy at y equal to 0 by CAS minus CA infinity. And all these things that I said about the thermal boundary layer would also be applicable here now in the concentration boundary layer. That delta C will increase with x, right? The local heat transfer coefficient, or rather the local mass transfer coefficient, will decrease with x, and so would be the local uh, molar mass flux that will decrease with distance along the surface. The last thing again I want to remind you is that the velocity boundary layer would always be there as long as there is a surface at rest and the fluid velocity is not the same as the surface velocity. But the but rather the thermal boundary layer and the concentration boundary layer will only develop if there is a difference in concentrations or difference in temperatures. So please remember this. Don't forget this. Now, what I wanted to show you today is this one last thing. I think I have this time for another just 5 more minutes, and so I will just show one last thing and end the lecture there, and then we'll carry on from there in the next class. is that just to look at the velocity boundary layer and how the flow basically influences transport across a boundary layer. So here is a picture that you may be familiar with. So we have free stream velocity over a flat surface, and what has been shown is the edge of the boundary layer. So there's a regime, or there's a region or distance along which the flow remains laminar. And laminar flow basically is one where the flow lines are or rather the flow happens within layers. So the flow is streamlines moving along a certain line or along a certain streamline, and then there is no any perturbation or any fluctuation in the flow field is basically damped out, or is killed out. If you're not familiar with what damping is, it is killed out because of viscous dissipation, or because of viscous effects in the boundary layer. So this is a very well defined, a very regular boundary layer which grows gradually. What happens beyond the laminar boundary layer is a region of transition. Transition is something that is not very well understood, except there we know that it flow will basically does not suddenly transform to turbulent flow, but it's a transition zone. But more importantly, when you look at the turbulent regime is marked by large fluctuations, or fluctuations that can no longer be dissipated by the viscosity of the fluid. And so these fluctuations grow. They lead to large, as I've shown here, or as the author has shown here, they lead to these large vortical structures, or what are called as eddies inside the boundary layer. And these eddies create a lot of mixing across the boundary layer. So they enhance the transfer of momentum, they enhance the transfer of heat transfer. They also enhance the transfer of mass flux across this boundary layer. So turbulent flow, and in the turbulent flow again, the boundary layer is much more thicker, okay, because of these enhanced motions, these large eddies which become dominant. And as we will see when we do a few of these calculations, turbulence will actually lead to much higher rates of heat transfer and mass transfer across the boundary layer as compared to laminar flow. And you should also know that whatever problems we see in practice, there are more scenarios of turbulent flow as compared to laminar. Laminar is a very special case which we very hardly see in nature. Most of the flows in nature, I would say 99.9% of the flows in nature are actually turbulent flows. Laminar is just a very set, or a description which is easy to understand or easy to write in terms of mathematics. So we try and we study that. But laminar is not one of those very commonly seen scenarios. So what I'm saying here is that if we look at, let's say in this case, if I had to plot the heat transfer coefficient, and I will try and plot it on the same scale. So let's say along the length. So I start with x equal to 0, and I'm going to plot h and delta, the boundary layer thickness, the hydrodynamic or the velocity boundary layer thickness on this plate here. So we see that in laminar flow, the delta increases gradually, as I was saying. So I'm going to plot delta with maybe slightly, let's say, an orange color. So delta grows. In transition, we don't have much data, so I'm just going to do some extrapolation there, or interpolation rather. But in turbulent flow, the boundary layer becomes much thicker, so it jumps and it also grows gradually. So this is the turbulent side of the flow, and this is the laminar side. In between, typically we just join the lines by a dotted segment to show that their data there is not known, and so we don't know what the boundary layer thicknesses there are. So this is delta. The heat transfer coefficient shows a slightly different behavior. The heat transfer coefficient starts from a maximum and it decreases until it hits the transition regime. But in the fully turbulent regime, as I said, because heat transfer rate is enhanced because of these mixing, or because of these eddies, high energy eddies. So the heat transfer coefficient beyond this point increases and it starts somewhat like that. In between, again, we don't have data, so we just show it in that manner. So turbulent flow will be marked by large heat transfer coefficients. Laminar flow will be marked by small heat transfer coefficients. The transition we will typically define for a flat plate. The transition will be defined in terms of Reynolds number, which you have also probably worked out. So Re x or rho u infinity x by mu, and the transition typically happens, which I'm going to denote by a number subscript c, the critical Reynolds number. That will happen around 10 to the power 5, or we will take a mean value of 10 to the power 5 into 10 to the power 5 as the transition point, which will be given by the position xc along the plate. Okay, so anyway, I'll stop it here now.